Stopping doubt feels like the greatest victory a mind can achieve. It feels like strength. It feels like clarity. It feels like the moment everything finally falls into place. And that's exactly why no one sees what comes next. It wasn't what Noah did that changed everything. It was something no one can detect in themselves. In the exact moment doubt goes silent, there's something buried inside that silence that most people will never examine. And once you understand what was happening inside Noah at that moment, you will never look at your own certainty the same way again. Before anything changed, something was still working. Not faith, not strength, not certainty, something far quieter than any of those. And it's exactly that silence that no one ever stops to examine. Noah's mind at this point was still intact, not in the sense that it was right, in the sense that it was still alive, still asking, still checking, still holding open a specific capacity that most people lose without ever realizing it's gone. And what's being uncovered here isn't really about Noah. It's about something inside you too, something that's either operating right now or has already stopped and you don't know which one. There's a line that separates two completely different internal states, and they look identical from the outside. They feel identical from the inside. The only difference between them is invisible, and that invisible difference is what determines everything that follows. Noah was still on the right side of that line, for now. A mind that still questions is a mind that's still connected to what hasn't been fully processed yet. That's not weakness. That's the only thing standing between a conclusion and that conclusion becoming permanent before it should. And Noah carried this with a kind of steadiness that very few minds can sustain, especially when there's no outside voice confirming what's being perceived. Years holding a direction no one else could see. Years of clarity surrounded by people who weren't looking. Years carrying something alone without knowing what that kind of weight does to a mind over time. That kind of isolation changes something internally. Not right away, not with any visible signal, but by the time that change becomes noticeable, it's already past the point of reversal. At this moment, the questioning was still active. The internal checking was still happening, and there was something specific that process was protecting, something Noah didn't yet know needed protecting, because when something works perfectly for long enough, the mind stops watching it. Not out of carelessness, out of trust, and that's not where the problem starts. That's where the problem finds room. There's no warning for this kind of shift, no identifiable moment, no feeling of loss. There's only a day when the question simply doesn't show up, and the mind doesn't register the absence, because the absence feels exactly like the presence. Noah wasn't there yet, but something had already begun moving quietly in that direction. No name, no visible shape, no signal that anything was happening at all, and the detail that changes everything is that this movement doesn't begin with weakness. It begins with the one thing Noah trusted most about himself, and you don't know what that is yet. And that thing, the thing he trusted most, wasn't what you're thinking. It wasn't strength, it wasn't faith, it wasn't clarity. It was something most people will never be able to name inside themselves. And that's precisely why it's impossible to notice when it starts working against you. There was something Noah did better than any other mind around him. Not dramatically, not visibly, in a way that only exists in minds that have held a direction alone, long enough to build their own internal pattern. And internal patterns do something that no external pressure ever can. They convince without arguing. Noah had been repeating something for years, not an action, something internal, something that had always produced the right result every single time. And this is where something begins that no outside observer could have detected. Not at that moment, not that week, but at some point inside that period. Repetition started doing what repetition always does when no one is watching it. And the detail most people will miss completely is that this process doesn't look like a problem. It looks like progress. It looks like growth. Like something that finally settled after years of effort. Noah didn't see it. Not because he wasn't paying attention, but because what was happening spoke exactly the language he had learned to trust. And when something uses the right language, the mind stops reading the content. It only reads the tone. There was something specific still functioning at this point, an internal mechanism, silent, that most people never realize they have, until the day they realize they don't have it anymore. Noah still had it, but something was happening at the edges of it, something that produced no symptom, no signal, no sensation that it needed attention. And the things that produce no signal that they need attention are exactly the things that need it most. The problem wasn't where he was looking. It never was. And what comes next isn't about what Noah failed to do. It's about what he failed to notice, inside something that still looked completely intact. That word was doing a silent job Noah never asked it to do. Because intact convinces, and what convinces stops being checked. A thought appeared, not different from the others, not heavier, not marked in any way that said it needed special attention. It simply appeared, and it wasn't interrupted. Now, before moving forward, you need to understand what wasn't interrupted means inside a mind that had spent years interrupting exactly that kind of thought. It's not the thought that matters here. It's the silence that came after it. That silence had no name. It produced no discomfort. It left no trace. And that's exactly the kind of silence, the kind that doesn't bother anyone, that never gets examined. There was something inside that specific thought that needed resistance to remain just a thought. And the resistance didn't show up. Not because it was removed, but because something had shifted in the frequency with which it was triggered, without that shift ever being registered. And here is the detail that will change how you read everything that comes after. Noah didn't allow that thought. But the absence of refusal, inside a mind like his, is indistinguishable from permission. He didn't know that. Nobody does. Not in the moment it's happening. And what that thought began doing inside him, from that silence forward, didn't need a second chance, didn't need reinforcement, didn't need repetition. It only needed for no one to be paying attention. And no one was, not even him. The day continued exactly the same. Same environment, same internal feeling, same everything. Nothing signaled that something had entered and decided to stay. And what decides to stay inside a stable mind doesn't arrive as an invasion. It arrives as a conclusion, and conclusions don't ask to be reviewed. They simply begin directing what comes next, without announcing, without warning, and with no way to trace it back to the exact moment it all started, because that moment was already gone. And what was forming inside Noah now no longer had the shape of a thought. It had the shape of a direction he hadn't yet recognized as his own. But that was already moving everything. And the first thing you need to understand about that is that everything doesn't mean what it sounds like. It's not behavior, not choice, not action. It's something that exists before any of those. Something that operates at a level where decisions don't have names yet, where they're still just inclinations. A quiet pressure in a direction the mind hasn't recognized as pressure yet. And it was exactly at that level, silent, unmarked, unregistered, that something inside Noah began to move. Not all at once, at the exact speed of something that doesn't need to rush, because it was no longer meeting resistance. Now there is something that happens to minds that carry a direction alone for long enough. Something that almost no analysis of human behavior has the courage to name directly. Not because it's too complex, but because it's too close. When a mind holds something alone for years, it begins at some point that cannot be identified to confuse the weight with the direction. Don't keep going yet. Read that again. It begins to confuse the weight with the direction. What that means inside what was happening to Noah, you don't have yet, and you won't. Not now, because the full meaning of that only surfaces after one specific thing, something that hasn't been revealed yet. And when it is, that sentence will come back with completely different weight. For now, what matters is this. There was a structure inside Noah that had been built in isolation, a structure that learned to function without external confirmation, without echo, without validation, without anything checking it from the outside. And that had been, for years, exactly what made him unshakable. But structures built in isolation do something that structures built in connection don't. They stop updating, not with visible failure, not with collapse. They simply begin responding to what they were built to respond to, instead of responding to what's actually there. And no one ever sees this from the inside, ever. Because from the inside, everything keeps looking exactly the same. Same clarity, same steadiness, same feeling of alignment that was always there. But there was something Noah was assuming, not as a belief, not as a decision, as background structure, an invisible premise. And invisible premises don't operate quietly, they operate completely. Everything perceived passes through them. Everything processed is filtered by them. Everything decided is shaped by them, without the mind ever noticing that's what's happening. Noah was seeing clearly, but he was seeing through something that had changed shape, without that change leaving any internal trace. And when the instrument of perception shifts without being noticed, perception keeps feeling accurate, keeps feeling sharp, keeps producing the exact same sensation it always has. But it's no longer pointed at the same place. Noah wasn't wrong about what he saw. He was wrong about where he was standing when he saw it, and that specific distinction is the one no one can ever detect in themselves. Because where you're standing doesn't produce sensation. Only what you're looking at does. And what Noah was looking at still felt completely right. Same consistency as always. Same conviction as always. Same internal sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But the center from which all of that was being generated was no longer the same center. And this is where everything stops for just a moment. Not to explain, to let you feel the weight of what was just said. There is no internal memory of when the center shifted. No date, no signal, no identifiable moment of crossing. There is only the state before and the state after, with no visible line between them. Noah was now fully in the state after, completely, without knowing, without feeling it, without a single indication that anything had become different. And here is the part that doesn't leave once you understand it. What Noah does next won't look like a mistake. Not to him, not to anyone watching. It will look like the most natural, most consistent, most aligned thing he could possibly do. And that, precisely that, is what will make it impossible to reverse what was already completely formed. Because the danger that doesn't look like danger has no defense built against it. And what was about to become visible inside Noah had already decided its own direction. Long before any action, long before any conscious thought, in a moment that no longer exists, and that can never be recovered. And what can't be recovered never announces when it stops being recoverable. It simply becomes the new starting point. And it was from that new starting point that Noah was, at this moment, operating. No feeling of replacement, no feeling of deviation, just the natural continuity of someone who still recognizes their own mind, without knowing that what they're recognizing is no longer what it was. Now, there's something nobody talks about when a decision is already formed internally. Not the moment it's made, the moment before, the moment when it already exists, but doesn't have a name yet. No recognizable shape. Can't be pointed to. And it's exactly in that interval, between existing and being recognized, that it does the quietest and most permanent work a decision can do. It organizes, without asking, without announcing. It begins rearranging what feels relevant and what doesn't, what deserves attention, and what can be set aside, what confirms and what contradicts. And all of it happens with such precise smoothness that the end result doesn't feel like rearrangement. It feels like clarity. Noah's mind, at this moment, was completely clear. That's not irony, that's the mechanism. Because clarity produced by a structure that's already been reoriented is indistinguishable from real clarity. Same weight, same tone, the same internal quality that had served for years as the signal of alignment. And here is something that needs to be said, something that's going to feel wrong the first time you read it. Noah wasn't mistaken about what he perceived. He was correct about almost everything he saw. The precision was still there. The discernment was still operating, and that's exactly it. The combination of real accuracy and undetected displacement is what makes what was happening impossible to intercept from the inside. Because the mind doesn't look for what's working, it looks for what's failing, and nothing was failing. There was only one thing. One thing he hadn't checked, not out of carelessness, not out of mental fatigue, but because the internal process that should have generated the need for that check had stopped operating, silently, at the exact moment when that check could still have changed something. Now it wouldn't. Not because the information didn't exist, but because the structure that would have processed that information as urgent had already been shaped around a conclusion that left no room for it. And conclusions that leave no room don't produce doubt. They produce inevitability, and inevitability is the most silently destructive state a mind can inhabit, because it closes questioning down not as failure, but as maturity, as proof that the process is complete, as the specific feeling that finally, it's no longer necessary to ask. Noah was in that state, with the exact internal quality of someone who knows what comes next, who has no reason to pause, who feels in every layer they can examine that they are exactly where they're supposed to be. And they were, just not in the way they believed. Something was forming, not as a thought, not as intention, as movement already underway inside a structure that had been completely reorganized, without a single internal alarm going off, without a single layer of self-preservation reacting, without any part of him recognizing that it needed to react. And what moves through a mind without meeting any internal reaction finds no wall, finds no limit, finds nothing to force it into a question before it becomes action. It simply arrives, and when it arrives, it already looks like something that was always there. That's what was about to become visible. Not a mistake Noah made, but the exact absence of something that should have resisted, and that had at some point neither could identify, simply stopped existing. And what follows that kind of absence doesn't look like a collapse. It looks like a continuation that feels completely natural, completely consistent, completely aligned with everything that came before, and that carries inside it the only kind of consequence a mind is never prepared to recognize, the kind that arrived using its own voice. And that's exactly where everything shifts. Not because something new arrived, but because when the mind finally stops and actually listens to what it's been saying for weeks, it notices something that doesn't have an easy name. It notices that the voice is right, the logic is intact, the direction still makes sense, and yet something is wrong, not in the content, in the place it's speaking from. And that distinction, the one that arrived too late to be useful, is the kind of clarity that doesn't set you free. It only shows you, with absolute precision, with zero practical application, exactly where the drift began. Noah didn't collapse, didn't freeze, didn't react in any way that could be seen from the outside. What happened was quieter than any of those things. The mind that had operated for years with the feeling of total alignment felt for the first time the difference between being aligned and being accustomed. And that difference, the one that seemed too small to matter, was the exact size of the drift that had been accumulating. Not over days, over years. In every moment, the check didn't happen. In every moment, silence was read as confirmation. In every moment, the absence of resistance was mistaken for clarity. It was all there. All of it had left a trace, and the trace only became visible when there was nothing left to do with it. There's something about this specific moment that needs to be said. Not about Noah, about what this moment produces inside any mind that reaches it. It doesn't produce immediate regret. It doesn't produce chaos. It produces something far more unsettling than either. It produces stillness, a specific kind of stillness that comes from understanding without being able to undo, from seeing clearly without being able to go back, from recognizing the exact point of entry of something that already finished what it came to do. Noah was in that stillness now, and inside it, there was a question that had never been asked before. Not because there was no opportunity, but because the process that generates that question had been silenced at the exact moments when it was most needed, and the question wasn't about what he had done. It was about what he had failed to notice inside himself for long enough that what was in there changed without him present for it. Now, this is where it stops being about him. Because there's something in this sequence, in this specific progression of accumulated absences, that doesn't belong to a historical period, doesn't belong to a character. It belongs to a process, and processes don't have an era, they have conditions. And the conditions that allowed what happened inside Noah are not ancient conditions. They exist inside any mind that holds a direction long enough, inside any mind that has learned to trust itself, inside any mind that connected stability with alignment and stopped at some imperceptible point, checking whether the two were still the same thing. And there's a question that stays suspended here, not answered, not redirected, just left exactly where it needs to be felt before it's thought. There is something you are holding that is working well enough not to be examined. There is a direction you are carrying that may have already started confusing the weight with the destination. There is a thought that passed through recently that didn't meet resistance, and you don't know which one it is. If you did, it wouldn't be that one. What operates below perception doesn't show up to be recognized. It shows up as part of who you are, as something that was always there, as a certainty that doesn't need to be verified, because the feeling it produces is identical to truth. Noah felt exactly that, for years, until the moment when feeling it was no longer enough. And the final detail, the one that stays long after everything else fades, isn't what happened to him. It's the fact that when this process began inside Noah, he was at the most stable point of his entire life, more aligned than he had ever been, more clear than he had ever been, more certain than he had ever been, and completely unaware that stability, clarity, and certainty may be the three internal states most favorable to the start of this process. Not the least favorable, the most, because this process doesn't begin where there is weakness. It begins where there is enough trust to stop questioning. And if you're reading this right now with the feeling that you're stable, that you're clear, that you're aligned, then you already carry the only condition this process needs. The only question that actually matters now, isn't whether this is happening inside you, it's how far along it already is. And that question, no one can answer for you, not from the outside, not from the inside, not while the process is still active. Only after, always only after.